Welcome to Ground Rules, Employment Law Over Your Coffee Break. My name's Pam Howlett, and I'm here today with Jennifer Walrath and Doug Plass, who are two attorneys who work here with me at Idaho Employment Lawyers. Last week, we dove in to love in the workplace in honor of Valentine's Day this month. And after we were done recording that podcast, we had so many things to say about harassment in general in the workplace and about some of the topics that we just barely touched on in our Love in the Workplace session that we decided today we were going to revisit that. And so today we're going to be talking more about harassment in the workplace, and we're going to dive in to that EEOC chart of risk factors for harassment and responsive strategies that we mentioned in our podcast last time. So the EEOC did a lot of work in 2016, and they kicked out a lot of great work product that I think still remains very viable today when it comes to great guidance for employers to follow. And we want to touch on that a little bit too, just because a lot of the same issues that applied then, guess what? They still apply now. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about some best practices. We're going to talk about some other guidance and checklists. And we're going to talk about some situations and cases that we've run into that really highlight the need for employers to be thinking about how they can best develop a culture where harassment is prohibited and disallowed and where employees feel safe bringing complaints and reports. We not only were thinking about that in terms of Valentine's Day this month, but the world in general, what we're getting feedback from in regard to our cohorts who are managing employees in the workplace is a general sense that maybe now more than ever, there are enough issues in the world that are creating strife in the workplace and mistrust and general conflict among employees who are showing up trying to do their job. And so it seems like a really good time to touch on harassment and possible responsive strategies. So check this out if you've never pulled it up. You can go to just Google EEOC chart of risk factors. And we are going to put this in the show notes too, so you'll have another way to find it. But don't ever underestimate how much guidance is out there from the EEOC. And once again, I know most of you know this by now, the EEOC is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and they oversee our federal laws that prohibit discrimination and harassment. So the EEOC has a lot of really good guidance out there. And these documents that we're going to be talking about today, including this chart, really complement some of the other guidance they have out there on various websites that they have up and running. So again, in 2016, the EEOC decided to dig deeper and figure out why employers were having so many complaints of harassment in the workplace. They convened a task force. They started talking to HR professionals, professors, lawyers, other leaders who were dealing with harassment, and they started compiling data on what types of issues signal a high risk for a culture where there's harassment. And that is what we see when we look at this chart of risk factors for harassment and responsive strategies. I was just going to note that there are some things that surface on here that we talked about in the last episode. And one of those is there is a risk factor related to workplaces with significant power disparities. So recall, we were talking about office romance. We were talking about how anytime you have a supervisor dating a subordinate, you may well have a power disparity and how that relates to claims of harassment. So the EEOC specifically calls out workplaces with significant power disparities as being one type of high-risk factor for harassment. Some of the things that the EEO says about that is that in such a workplace, you may have supervisors who feel emboldened to exploit low-ranking employees. You may have a situation where low-ranking employees are less likely to understand complaint channels. You may have a situation even with undocumented workers, maybe especially vulnerable to exploitation or the fear of retaliation. And I would say we'd all agree, like in today's world, maybe that's even a bigger threat now. So one thought that crossed my mind, which again we touched on last time, is just this whole law firm. We are a law firm. We're a little law firm here. But I think of law firms as a very clear hierarchy in my mind. And the EEOC data backing this up specifically references law firms. So I'm not making this up. But that is the type of scenario where you might have some high wage earning, rainmaking individuals, maybe who were kind of put on a pedestal compared with others, such as entry-level associates who walk in the door. And that type of scenario can cause harassment, high risk for that. Another scenario, which is also noted in that EEOC chart, is workplaces with high-value employees. Same type of situation where you may have a situation where a high-value employee perceives themselves as maybe exempt from workplace rules or immune from consequences of their misconduct. So those are a couple that jumped out at me on this chart. I'm going to let Doug and Jennifer jump in. Anything jumping out at you on this chart that maybe warrants a little more discussion?
Well, I think one of the ones on here that really jumped out at me, especially these days, although it certainly existed even before the switch in executive administrations here in our federal government, EEOC calls it coarsened social discourse outside the workplace. But essentially, when you might have employees who, whether it's, in person, through social media, in a personal events where coworkers are present, or even at work events, whether inside or outside the workplace, people just have strong opinions about topics of the day and are expressing them, and people might have disagreements about those issues. These days, some of those things are political issues that are coming up, maybe things that local governments are doing or not doing. Just some of these social issues, people have differing opinions and can express opinions that sometimes will offend or make other people in the workplace feel very uncomfortable coming to work and being at work. And sometimes comments like that might be intended to make others feel uncomfortable, but oftentimes they're not necessarily directed at anyone in particular. But even if they're not, intended to make anyone feel badly or feel discriminated against, to feel unwelcome in the workplace, those comments still may. And so whenever you're in an environment where there are opinions being expressed or things being done that make people in the workplace feel uncomfortable, it just creates an environment where an increased likelihood that someone at work is going to feel like they can't come to work and do their job the way they otherwise would because of something that a coworker or even a supervisor said or did, whether at work or in another scenario that bleeds into work. And again, social media these days can be a really big place for this happens, even on your personal social media accounts. Certainly not everything that someone says on their, personal social media page is going to be actionable at work. But there are ways in which that can come to work, whether it's coworkers discussing a post that someone made at work, or tagging a coworker in a post. Things like that can then start to nudge it into the workplace and create a situation where there's a potential for harassment that the employer needs to be concerned about.
Yeah, and I'll just say in regard to this coarsened social discourse outside the workplace, category that Jennifer's pointing out, we are hearing more and more of that. Anytime you have a group of people where people are talking about, this is my political affiliation and this is who I supported, and then another group saying that's not who I supported, I disagree with that, that is creating the type of atmosphere and culture where people are feeling maybe distrustful, and where it may be more likely to see some undertone of disrespect, possibly spiraling into something else. So I think that is definitely timely in the world we're living in right now, and something maybe a lot of employers are seeing.
And I was just going to mention one thing that stuck out to me was, and in part this because we were just having a conversation about this, but workplaces that tolerate or encourage alcohol consumption. So we're thinking about, one is the classic 3 martini lunch. Another is really the hospitality industry is a huge one, where, people may be drinking while they're working at times, but definitely at the end of their shifts when they're all together counting out their tips or whatever they're doing. And it's something that if it's going to be allowed, and, we would probably counsel against it, if it's going to be allowed, the people need to understand that even when there's alcohol involved, that doesn't mean all workplace policies and all expectations of conduct are going to have to go out the window. Like, you're still going to have to, train people to intervene if they see some misconduct, remind managers that if they see harassment, even if it's a Christmas party, they should take action right away. And, if you are in one of these situations and somebody's has drank too much alcohol, take steps to remove them from the situation. That's definitely something that we should do. And because there's always, once inhibitions are down and once people are more comfortable just kind of sharing whatever they feel in those type of environment, you're going to see some more types of harassing and discriminatory behavior. It just happens.
Well, or for example, think about, you have a Christmas party, people are drinking, you have a supervisor who makes maybe some comments, and I will use a sex discrimination case, but about how he really thinks that, women should be at home taking care of the kids and not in the workplace. Fast forward another month, and he has a female subordinate who's getting discipline for poor performance for the first time in like a 5-year career working at the company. Maybe there's a good reason for that discipline, but that employee could say, well, I heard my supervisor at a Christmas party making negative comments about his views of women in the workplace, and come to the conclusion that the real reason that this person's being discriminated or being disciplined is because of her gender. So I would say, too, in addition to just sort of harassment that can even occur at the time of the event that has the alcohol, sometimes, too, it also fosters an environment where things are said or done that then someone else later on might say, it's raising questions for me as to why I'm being treated the way that I am at work.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and along the lines of what Doug was talking about is, what is your policy going to be in regard to alcohol consumption? It doesn't always have to be a yes or a no. There is a middle ground there, too, where you can put on there something to the effect of responsible drinking, right, where policies are still followed. I mean, you can have parameters short of a total prohibition against alcohol, too. So another category that jumped out at me is one that says, according to the EEOC, workplaces where some employees do not conform to workplace norms. And that, according to the EEOC, is, for example, a rough and tumble or single-sex dominated workplace culture, a culture where remarks, jokes, or banter that may be crude, raunchy, or demeaning occur. I can't even tell you how often when we have claims come in one of the ways that employers try to justify that or to kind of downplay it is to say, well, you would just have to understand that culture. Maybe it's a construction culture. Maybe it's a military culture. Maybe it's a law enforcement culture. Doug talked a little bit about the restaurant industry. I mean, there are different types of industries that may lend themselves to that, but really that's not a defense, right? Like, we would never be able to go to court and say, Judge, you need to dismiss that harassment claim because it's just construction guys. And we all know that's what construction guys do. That's not good enough. It's not a defense. And employers who think that's somehow going to get them off the hook for a discriminatory or harassing remark need to think twice on that. We know, too, that the EEOC, as part of its enforcement priority last year, said we're going after the construction industry. So time to clean up your act. So if you are listening to this and you're in the construction industry, maybe pay special attention because you are a enforcement priority by the EEOC. And it's never a defense to just say that's always how we've done it. That's just how these guys are. That's just the way it is. That's not good enough. And if you're their HR director or you're over them, it's on you to try to shift that culture to a more compliant place.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, we were talking a little bit, for me, the thread that really runs through this issue is just a more, I guess, casual workplace. If you have a workplace that people tend to act more like friends than coworkers, some level of joking is tolerated, probably good to take a look at that and whether or not there's a need to have some training on just sort of core concept, respectful workplace. Certainly you want to have collegiality in the workplace, and that's important, but there is a difference between collegiality and friendly working relationships and tolerating, jokes and kind of aside comments that maybe are fine for 90% of the population in your workplace, but could be offending, another 5 or 10% of your workplace, right? Always better to train for the more professional, respectful workplace civility standard, right? And kind of the message being given that the goal is professionalism, keeping in mind, I think one of our favorite examples is like, if you said it, would you be embarrassed to tell your parents or your significant other what you said at work, right? Or tell your kids what you said at work. Things like that, right? To kind of be a gut check on behavior, to kind of keep that higher bar. So I think any kind of workplace, and many of the ones we just talked about as examples, can be those where it's just a more loose, casual environment. Always good to really emphasize civility, respect, professionalism in your training.
And I think we see a lot of people that are entrepreneurs or, people that have started a business. And I think a lot of times when people go into business, they think, I want to do this kind of just like me. And they don't think the fact that now if you're an employer, you have a heightened duty here and you can get yourself in trouble allowing everybody to behave without any guardrails whatsoever,
or even I want it to be different than where I used to be. But maybe once you're actually in that seat, you learn why things were a particular way where you used to work.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So check out the EEOC risk factors. They're now getting to be a little bit dated. I still think they apply, and it's a good tool for employers. Check it out. See if you find your workplace falling into any of these categories. And if they are, time to get to work, time to see if you can make sure you've got better practices that are aimed at preventing a culture where harassment is allowed or where it occurs. So how do you do that? What should you do? What should you be thinking about? What tools and resources are out there in order to make sure that if you're at high risk, that you've got a good, solid anti-harassment culture and workplace? Jennifer touched on one of the issues. It's almost always going to be training. That's why we're here, right? Is we believe deeply in training and doing everything you can to ever avoid getting pulled into a claim or lawsuit. That's what Law for Leaders is all about. What kind of training should you have? What do you need? Where can you find it? Interestingly, at the same time the EEOC came out with these risk factors, they came out with a series of checklists, and they had several checklists. One is the EEOC's version of what workplace training needs to look like. That is a great guide for you to check out. The EEOC came out with other harassment guidance in 2024. I'm pretty sure there's some training guidance in there too. It's a long document. There's a lot, but it's got great stuff in it. That's worth checking out too. The big takeaway on training is that your supervisors need more and different training than the rest of your workforce. Everybody needs some training. So even if you're in the construction industry, even if it's a militaristic culture, even if it's law enforcement, even if it's the restaurant industry, every employee there should be getting some level of training. The EEOC would say in-person training is better. You should have a live trainer if you can swing it. We all recognize maybe that's not possible for every location. Maybe it's cost prohibitive. Some training, even virtual, is better than nothing, but live training is always the gold standard. Why? Because it's interactive. It's interesting. You can ask questions. You can talk about what's happening in your workplace. There's a million reasons why live training is better. Doug, Jennifer, you guys have anything else on training that jumps out that you've seen work? Or
I would say, I guess, throwing another feather in the hat of live training, typically whenever we do them, and we do this kind of training, people do think about it. You can kind of see the employees engaging, thinking about situations they've run into, and it does seem to be effective, right? Because part of this isn't just checking the box on, I understand a rule, or there's not like a black and white list. I mean, certainly there are some behaviors you categorically need to avoid, but it really is getting people to think about what kind of behavior in the workplace we want to avoid. And there's going to be a spectrum of that, and people think about it in different ways. So truly, when you do the in-person training, between the questions you get and even just looking at employees, and supervisors, you can see them thinking about it. And I think really coming to a better understanding of the kinds of conduct that we want to avoid, and the kinds of conduct that just, maybe aren't a good idea, even if they're not automatically going to lead to a lawsuit tomorrow, right? That kind of how we want to be treated in the workplace and treating our coworkers with consideration and respect.
And most good anti-harassment training involves like working through hypothetical scenarios with people. And I think that if you do that in a live environment, you do that with everybody kind of together doing it as one, it's a better learning experience for everybody all around. So training, and more training.
At about the time these checklists came out, there were some public service training videos that came out too. And you can find them by Googling "that's harassment." They're really good. And they used, famous actresses and actors, and they're free and they're pretty good. We use them sometimes in our training because it gets a dialogue going. Check those out too if you're looking, just for some training options that are out there.
I was going to throw in one more thing to piggyback on Pam's comment earlier about yes, in-person is gold standard. However, video training is better than no training. We didn't talk about it, but one of the other risk factors for harassment that the EEOC has identified is decentralized workplaces, right? Or having isolated locations. Those also may well be the kinds of locations where it's difficult to have employees come together and travel maybe somewhere else for an in-person training, or to get someone up there to do an in-person training for that group. But certainly in today's world especially, there's technology. And generally speaking, it's going to be possible to pipe in some kind of training, and maybe even to do, whether it's taped training or a live interactive training, just using a video platform. So certainly things to consider and keep in mind that there will be a way to get some kind of training to your employees this day and age, even if they are in a smaller or more separated, isolated location.
Yep. So another checklist that the EEOC has out there is what your policies should look like in order to give you the best leg up in making sure you've got a culture where there is not harassment and discrimination. The policies in those checklists, check that out. Like, cross-reference the policy you've got right now. Do you have a good reporting mechanism? Does it follow what they're telling you the type of reporting mechanism it should have? Do you say you're going to promptly and fairly investigate if a complaint's made? Check all of that out. And then the last thing that is a checklist the EEOC has, which I think is also very valuable and 100% true, is a checklist that talks about the role leadership has to play in order for you to have a culture that is harassment-free. So sometimes we have clients who will call and say, we need you to come in and do training, or I want you to come in and do training, but I can't get the CEO interested. I can't get the vice president interested. Or HR might say, we had a training and I was the only member of the leadership team there. This can be the root of the problem in a workplace culture. If your high-level leaders don't care enough to come to the training, to show they're invested in the training, to participate in the training, that can be a huge problem. So the EEOC also has a checklist that talks about the extent to which your leadership needs to be engaged in order to have a culture free of harassment and discrimination. So I would say the only other thing I would add to that list that we haven't talked about is just really the need to stay updated. What we have seen in the last year, all throughout 2024, we saw substantial changes in the law. It felt like at times employers were not keeping up with that, whether it was the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, regulations that really explained how that act is going to play out in real life. We saw some wage and hour, DOL regs. It just felt a little bit in 2024 like things were happening so quickly, employers could not keep up. Now we're in 2025. By all accounts, based on the way the first 5 weeks of the year have gone, it looks like it's going to be a year where we could see more significant changes. So stay caught up with all of that. So we offer training. Don't forget about Law for Leaders. And what we've talked about today, if you have that training, is somewhat covered in the anti-discrimination and anti-harassment sessions. We also just have a book that we released. We talk about anti-harassment and anti-discrimination there. We have a great overview in chapters 5 and 6. And again, we have our book launch party coming up on March 4th. If you're in Idaho and want to join us for that, we would love to see you there. More info on that you can find in the episode description or the show notes. So that's it for today. Thanks for joining us for Ground Rules.
Ground Rules hosts and guests are not providing legal advice in this podcast. Do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction.